Good morning, everybody. It's my name's Nick Hillman from HEPI. I'm just waiting for the numbers to stabilise because the number of participants is still ramping up, and then we'll kick off the webinar properly. So let's start with a few introductory remarks. Good morning, everybody. My name's Nick Hillman. I'm Director of HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute. Most of you must know who we are because you're on this webinar. But if you don't, we're an Oxford-based think tank that's supported by most universities up and down the UK and a small number of corporates, including our partner for this morning's session, TechnologyOne, who are a software a company based in Australia and who already work with lots of UK universities, so you may already be familiar with them. And the essay question we're here to answer is a really big one this morning. It's how much money do students need to live on? Not live on to avoid absolute extreme poverty, but live on so that they can engage as a fully fledged student, maybe join a society or two, maybe afford the bus fare to get into the library, to be able to live and eat healthily and clothe themselves properly. So that's the essay question. And the reason we're doing it today is because we've launched this morning this report with, as I say, our partners TechnologyOne. All the hard work has been done by Loughborough University, who we're about to hear from. And this goes through in rigorous detail exactly how much money students need to live on, how that differs to other people in society, what is essential for student life and what is not necessarily absolutely essential, but necessary to be fully engaged. It's already been described, I'm pleased to see, on social media this morning as probably the most important HE policy report of the year. Not bad, given we're only in May. You might have read about it in the newspapers this morning or seen it on BBC Breakfast or heard about it on the Today programme. So as I say, we've worked with researchers to answer this essay question at Loughborough University, and they have done a huge amount of work with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and others over many, many years to answer this question. What is a minimum income that different people need to be a full citizen? And to be able to play a full part in the community in which they are living and working and studying in this case. So the format for today is first we're going to hear exactly from that team, Dr. Katherine Hill from Loughborough University, who's going to talk about the methodology and the findings in the report. And she is a research fellow at the Centre for Research in Social Policy at Loughborough University. We're then going to hear about the policy implications from my colleague, Josh Freeman, HEPI's policy manager, and Josh has led the work from HEPI's end, though I should say neither HEPI nor TechnologyOne have had editorial control over the numbers at all. These are Loughborough's numbers, and they stand or fall on the back of Loughborough's huge research, including the focus groups with students that you'll hear about. We'll then hear about from Jane Harrington, Professor Jane Harrington, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Greenwich, about how she sees these findings and what it means for her students and how university managers might see these findings. And last but by no means least, in some respects, the most important voice of the morning is going to be Nyah Lowe, because Nyah is a student, president of Bangor Students' Union, and will be responding to the findings from the students' perspective. I'm going to ask our speakers to keep to time as much as possible so that we can have a good 20 to 30 minutes for Q&A from the floor, from all of you afterwards. Do type in your question in the Q&A. Do upvote other people's questions. So if there's a question you think that's really good, I really want to know the answer for that, upvote it, because I will go to the questions that are at the top of the list before I go to the ones further down. We will try to get people, so if you've got a question, you want to pose it, we'll try to turn on your microphone so you can actually articulate your own question and put it in your own voice. If you don't want to do that, you can post the question anonymously or add a little PS to your question saying you don't want your microphone turned on because you're in a busy place. We won't turn on anybody's cameras. We'll only turn on your microphones. I think that's all the housekeeping from me. So over to you, Katherine. We're going to have some slides from Katherine and Josh, so we'll just set those up.
Thanks, Nick. Okay. Is that okay?
We can see that perfectly. Thanks.
Excellent. Right. Okay. Well, thanks for that introduction, Nick. What I'm going to do is just sort of briefly outline our method and how we applied this to the research with students that's been launched today. So the minimum income standard, as Nick said, it's a research method that we've established since 2008, and it sets out what people need for a minimum socially acceptable standard of living in the UK today. And it provides budgets for different household types, which are regularly updated. So how we do this work, there's some sort of key principles behind it. First, it's what we call bottom up. So it's based on detailed discussions with members of the public, talking to different sorts of households about what they need for this minimum standard of living. The focus of all our work is on having a minimum acceptable standard of living. So it's identifying what people need, not what people want as such. But within that, there's some key principles that guide the conversations we have. And this is central to the work that myself and my colleague Matt did with students in this research. So at the heart of the research, hold on, I'm just trying to go right. So at the heart of the minimum income standard are these key ideas. So it's about choice, not having to be limited to just one thing or the cheapest of something, but having this element of choice. It's about connection. So being connected and feeling part of the world around us is sort of fundamentally important to the minimum income standard. And it's about being able to take opportunities. So not endless opportunities, but being able to join in, do some of the things that people might take for granted or that are sort of norms within our society. And also it's about security, so financial security and physical security. And these all combine to enable people to live with dignity. So this is the definition that we use in all of our minimum income standard research, and it's a starting point for the conversations. So you can see it's about these key things, so like food, clothes and shelter, but it's more than that. So it's not just survival, it's having what you need to have these opportunities and these choices to take part in society. So being able to take part in the world around us. And that's very much what the conversations we had with students were around. So it's what they need to participate in the world around them. So how did we do this research with students? So we were aware that the students are in a wide range of different situations, which we can't cover all of these scenarios. So we agreed with HEPI for a particular scenario as a sort of starting point. So this is for someone living in shared private rented accommodation, a second or third year undergraduate student, recognising that people who are in a first year or living in halls might have different needs, and also domestic rather than international student. It's focused not on mature students, where again, where needs may vary. So it's very much a starting point in that respect. And following our minimum income standard or MIS approach, we talked to people, students themselves who are in the situation that's under discussion. So we held discussion groups with students. We had 4 focus groups in 4 different cities across the UK. We had between 8 and 10 people in each group, and it covered 10 people from 10 different universities, because we deliberately chose areas where there was more than one university in that location. So we used what we call case studies, a made-up example. So people aren't focusing on their own particular needs and costs. So the first group, we developed this, and it's about a student who shares with 4 other people in a furnished private rented accommodation where they share bills. And the students agreed with us that that was a sort of relatable scenario. So we then held the sequence of groups to go through in detail what's needed sort of in the home, for university life, and more broadly, which fed through from one group to the next. And And from then we could have detailed discussions about what's included, and then we can cost that, which we put into a budget. So I'm just going to say a little bit about what's behind the discussions. So because we have these detailed discussions, it's not just coming up with figures that I'm going to share with you in a moment, but it actually provides reasons behind why things are included. And it's useful because it really shows how the discussions are centred on identifying a sort of minimum acceptable standard. So it's a minimum, but it does include this sort of element of participation as well. So some of the quotes here, these quotes are from people who took part in the groups. So starting with what students need at the home. So it's about having an acceptable living environment in the context of being in shared student housing. So it's in furnished accommodation, but I think it's generally quite basic level is the feeling. So it's about making it a more homely space. So having things to make it feel more comfortable, and which people talked about this being important for their well-being. It's about having a sort of social space as well. You're living with other people, so having a communal space, being able to socialise in the home with your housemates, so a communal television. And they also talked about having Netflix. So it's about being able to take part in things that other people do, talk about it with your mates, and also just a way of relaxing, getting away from the pressures of studying, a way of chilling out. It's about living with others as well, being a student. So it involves some sharing. So some of the items are costed as shared items, so it's like a split cost. Other items are individual. So for example, in the kitchen, some sort of basic elements of things, but also to have some individual things. So it's about also what you need to get along with people in a shared house in that environment. The bedroom is also an important sort of multi-purpose area. So again, that includes things that they need a bit of extra storage, because you're not only sleeping in your room, you're studying in your room, you're dealing with your clothes and so on in your room. So that's about having what they need for a decent, reasonable home environment. Then the other aspect is university-related needs. So here, in particular, the laptop and the mobile were seen as essential items, not just because a mobile's needed for everyday life, but it's about accessing your university account. The laptop is vital. That almost, they're saying it's an expectation that you need a laptop at the university. And also there's a sort of, what came up with a wide variation in these sort of university-related, study-related needs. So we talked about this as a minimum. So as a minimum, we've included a small budget, but there's recognition within the groups that this can vary considerably. So it depends if your course needs a lot of books or a budget for printing. For example, people talked about being on a teaching placement where they have to have their own printing. Now that would be extra to people in those situations. And the example in this quote here, where they're talking about a placement year abroad, the budget there would be a minimum, so it would need extra on top of what we're talking about in our budget. The other aspect is about university life, sort of. So people talk very much about the importance of social life, the importance of being able to socialise. And again, this goes back to sort of being able to participate in society, not feel left out, be included in the world around you. And again, linked it back to mental health and well-being as well. So it relates to the sort of definition of not just surviving, existing. So things are included that would be sort of usual for young people in generally. So being able to go out, go to the gym, for example, have a meal out from time to time. But they also emphasised the needs for students to have this opportunity to take part in university-related activities. So this has been part of societies and clubs or sports which involve costs or subscriptions. Being able to, and they said again, that's important, it's about making friends, being able to sort of feel included, and also things like costs for university life. So being able to celebrate the end of exams, the university might put on an event, a ball, and also the cost of sort of graduation. So these things were included. They felt it was important to the student experience, combined to bring that. So as a minimum, that's what people said they needed. So I think it's clear that it's a minimum. It's not an extravagant level of provision that's in the budgets. It's what students felt was needed. It's a term we use. It's a need to have, not a nice to have. But it's a level that will enable someone to participate, not feel left out, have some choices and opportunities at this sort of important stage of life for students. But also, as I've referred to a few times, something that came out was students referred back to sort of being mindful about their well-being and mental health, so socialising, making your living space comfortable. And I think that's really important to bear in mind, given sort of mental health among young people and the pressures of university. So I'll just go on to briefly talk about sort of the key thing is, what does this all add up to? So we've got lots of detail in our report that's published today, but based on what students told us, to reach this minimum standard, they need £244 a week, but that's excluding rent. So once you include the rent figure, which here was based on an average rent for shared private rented accommodation, it comes to £366 a week. I'm just going to show the next slide, which sort of makes it a bit easier to see how it sort of pans out. And here you can see that rent is the highest single area, and that accounts for a third of the budget overall. And actually, to emphasise the point that it's not an extravagant budget, the rent, and if we also include the utility bills, the food within the home and clothing, that comes to 59% of the weekly budget. So it's sort of clear that food, clothes and shelter, these sort of key elements for survival, make up over half of what students need. So what I'm going to do now is pass on to Josh, who's going to talk about how this compares to how students may meet these needs.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Katherine. I'm just going to share my screen as well. It was really brilliant, actually, to work with the Centre for Research in Social Policy on this, and to sit in on the focus groups as well. And the detail that they go into is fantastic. It's well worth reading the report just for the detail on students' lives and their spending patterns. And I mean, the detail they get into is incredible. I think we had a 20-minute conversation on whether students need a doormat went in the focus group in Cardiff. So it is a fantastic level of detail. Katherine, you can see that on your screen, okay? Is that all?
Yes.
Fantastic. That's great. So I'm going to take you through the sort of broader policy implications of Loughborough's calculations. What does this mean, particularly in terms of maintenance support and parental contributions? I think the first thing to talk about then is what this comes to in terms of an annual amount. We took that rent figure, that median rent figure Katherine mentioned just now, and we sort of adjusted it based on average rents outside of London and the average rents within London. We put that all together with the weekly cost of everything else, all of the other expenditure that students have. And that gave us these numbers. So the minimum income standard for students outside London is about £18,600. And for students studying in London, it's just under £21,800. And again, that is for this one type of student. And obviously there will be lots of variation between students. I mean, students living in Bristol will be paying much more rent than students in Sheffield, for example. But this is a median rent figure, and this is a baseline for the students that we've looked at. And what this means is that's the sort of the figure that we've got for this category of students. And when we saw this, we were obviously quite struck by it. You'll see in a moment it's significantly more than the level of maintenance support that's available. But it's not significantly out of touch with other measures of what people this age need. Actually, it's well in touch with that. So, for example, someone who's 18 to 20 years old working full-time, so that's 37.5 hours a week, on minimum wage, which is £8.60 an hour, will be earning just shy of £17,000. So a little less, but not substantially less than is for outside of London. And someone who's working full-time on the national living wage would be earning over £22,000, so well over the amount that you get, even that you need even for studying in London. So it is, though a significant amount, it is in touch with other measures for what people need to live on. This is a measure of how the maintenance load compares then. And then we've got all of the 4 nations in here. As I say, the focus groups took place in England, but we also had 2 in England, 1 in Wales and 1 in Scotland. So it is a fully UK-wide report. And you'll see here that maintenance support falls short even in Wales, which has the UK's most generous system, and particularly in Northern Ireland, where less than half of students' costs, as measured by Ms, are covered by the level of maintenance support, as a gap of more than £8,000, about £8,400 in England between what students currently receive and what they need. And for those studying in London, it's a similar story, slightly higher percentage of costs covered in England, and in Wales, a smaller percentage of costs covered in Scotland, obviously because Scotland doesn't have a specific product for students studying in London. So, but only in one case, only Wales is more than, for students studying in London, is more than 2/3 of costs covered by the maintenance support. So it confirms what we already knew, which is that maintenance support is inadequate, but we finally get a measure of how much by, which is the one of the great values of this research, we think. The implications of this then are quite significant. For example, if a student were to try and make the gap up with paid work, as we know many of them do, more than half of them, more than half of students now work full-time during term time, they would have to work a very significant number of hours to get there. So nearly 19 hours in England a week at minimum wage, and more than 23 hours a week in Northern Ireland in order to make up that difference. So it is a very substantial difference, and requires a level of paid work that's likely to have a significant effect, both on student studies, but also their ability to participate in social activities and extracurricular activities around their studies. Looking at it from the perspective of a parental contribution, the amounts that are required to contribute are quite significant. This was one of the things that really struck us when we were doing the research for it. So someone receiving the maximum loan we've already established in England is £8,400 short. But when that goes to a student receiving the minimum level of maintenance support, that goes up to nearly £14,000 in parental contribution. Similar levels in Northern Ireland for those on the minimum level of support, slightly less in Scotland. In Wales, obviously, there's in theory no expectation that parents contribute. The level of maintenance support that students receive is the same at all income levels. The balance of grants and loans obviously changes, but the total level is the same. So it doesn't escalate there, but a very substantial amount in the other nations. I'm just going to check this. My slides are on the screen. Right. Apologies. I think I wasn't fully showing the slides, but hopefully you can see this now. So this is the level of parental support that you see. If I can go back and show some other slides in case those were missed earlier on. So just to round up this discussion on the parental contribution, these are the thresholds at which parents are expected to contribute. So in England, we know it's 25,000, above which parents are expected to provide some support for their student children. And the thresholds are lower in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. And we can compare this to previous research on minimum income standards that Loughborough have done for different household types. So for example, for a single working age adult, it would be just shy of £30,000, about £40,000 for a couple without children. And what this shows is parents are essentially being expected to contribute, even though they themselves don't have a minimum standard of living, and potentially having to choose between them getting them meeting their own living standards and their student children meeting their living standards. So our recommendation is for the level of maintenance support to be increased. Now, to what extent this should be increased is, I think, an important question, and one that we'd like to discuss today. But our suggestion is that it may well be reasonable for students to do some part-time work. It may not, when we're not necessarily calling for the maintenance support, cover the full level of the MIS that we've established by this research. One suggestion, and it is only a suggestion, is that students do 10 hours a week of part-time work, which is about the same as working full-time over the summer holidays and doing no paid work the rest of the year. And that would sort of allow students to choose whether they would to work constantly over the whole year, or in an intensive period over the summer when they may have less work associated with the higher education qualification. But that's up to is one suggestion, and we'd be very interested. I'd be very interested to hear what the panel thinks, and what you think as well. Thank you very much, and I will pass over now to Professor Harrington, who's going to respond to the report.
Thank you, Josh, and thanks very much for that. Josh, could you take your slide? Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I mean, I think where I'd like to start is I really welcome this report. I think it's really important. It's really valuable. It tells us, sadly, what we already knew, which is that actually there's a clear gap across all 4 nations between government maintenance support and actual living costs. And I think what's powerful about this report, though, is the conversations you've had with those students. I mean, Josh, you talked about a 20-minute conversation about maths, but actually to be able to have that level of detail, I think is really unique. So I think that's really helpful, and it gives us a framework actually now to have these conversations. And at the same time, I think the timing's really crucial. I mean, we all know that the cost of living has absolutely detrimentally affected our students, and the upcoming elections gives us an opportunity to really start this conversation with all parties and reset some of these considerations. And if I just take the University of Greenwich very briefly, and also I'm chair of University Alliance, which is a group of 16 universities like Greenwich. And in all of our cases, we do have a huge number of students who actually experience poverty and also have to work more and more to support their finances. And I'll come back to the hours that you just raised, Josh. But it's true across the piece, really. And certainly at Greenwich, over half of our new students come from some of the most deprived areas in the country, and around 70% of them commute to the university, and they work part-time and they have caring responsibilities. And I'd really value actually this report doing some further work on those types of that sort of broader picture of students, because the type of students that are covered in this report doesn't actually represent some of my students, and I suspect you'd find some slight differences. So it'd be really helpful to expand it in its sort of second phase, if it's possible. But certainly in 2023, our student union did a piece of work, and they did a report. And what they told us was that 50% of their respondents had less than £50 income available after essential expenses had been paid. And they also highlighted the fact that students with declared disabilities, caring responsibilities, those from low-income backgrounds, many of our international students, and those commuting more than an hour from their primary campus would be, and it won't surprise you to know, worse off across the board. So we know that we've absolutely got to address this. And universities have been doing a lot to support this. I mean, certainly, Josh, you did a report on beating the cost of learning crisis, and Greenwich was highlighted in there what we've been doing. But it's probably just worth mentioning, you know, we already provide over 1.5 million in bursaries for undergraduates, £180,000 in scholarships, £155,000 in hardship support, and that was in 22-23. We offer a free bus between 2 of our campuses, and we offer a heavily subsidised bus for the other one. We've frozen accommodation fees. We've put another 1.5 million into mental health services. We offer last year we had 339 students that we employed as student ambassadors, and our student union employed another 318. We have a digital access bursary. We have community breakfasts and dinners, food vouchers. And these are basics that we're offering here for people, but I think it just shows you the level that we already offer and the fact that actually we're probably at the point where we can't afford to offer much more. So it's how do we actually manage this, and what's the question? And your report talks about actually joining up some of the digital support, and I think that's right, so that we actually connect the finances with actual mental health needs, with etc. And there are some great examples. University of West London has a brilliant example of doing that actually, and so there's some great examples on how we could do that. But I do think it's about having a clear framework of support in place, some simple processes, and staff with the right skills, capabilities, and capacity to manage this. And really, just for me to finish, I just want to say that as a chair of University Alliance, what we've called for as a membership group fits very closely with this report. We said in the short term, we believe that student maintenance loans should be uprated to keep pace with the increased cost of living. And we've argued that that should be linked to the minimum wage as proposed in the Augur review. And in the medium term, we've recommended the reinstatement of means-tested maintenance grants so that students who are most in need get access to higher education, because otherwise we have a real danger that when we talk about work, actually our poorest students are the ones who have to work for longer and longer hours. That detrimentally affects their outcomes, and then it affects their employment ultimately. So we end up with spirals we never get out of. So I really welcome this report. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to stop talking and pass, I believe, over to Nyah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This report is, again, very, very well welcomed from students and students' unions, because this highlights what we already knew, reflecting what everybody else has said on the webinar. We hear so many students coming into the students' union, more and more students coming in with stories about how they can't cover costs, how they're struggling to feed themselves, how they're struggling to find part-time work. We've talked a bit about differences between English students, Welsh students and Scottish students, as well as Northern Irish students. But the differences within those nations is quite stark as well, reflecting what Professor Harrington said. So students who come from England to study in Wales are actually part of the Student Finance England system, so still get that maintenance loan calculated from their parents' income, where only about 50% of that is supported by their parents giving extra funding. So there's quite a lot of disparity between students coming from different nations to study in the nations themselves. But additional to that, there's different students from different backgrounds as well. So we've got students who are international students that are deeply affected by this, that don't have the support of maintenance loans, and have the added burden that the currency in their home countries is now not as worth as much as it was when they started studies. So widening this research out to broader groups of students, looking at maybe disabled students, students from different backgrounds, I would really welcome that as well. But where the research is at, it definitely shows that the maintenance loan is not enough. But what we're seeing as students' unions as a part of that is students' habits significantly changing. So over half are spending less on food, the other half spending less on heating, and 1 in 10 cutting back on sanitary products even. So this research was done by NUS earlier last year, and those numbers are sure to be even higher now. So these are some of the very direct impacts on students, but there are also slightly more indirect impacts to students' habits, such as participating in extracurricular activity, volunteering activity, and what they participate in day to day. Students have been really, really keen in the area of sustainability and activism in this space, but living a sustainable life is a lot more expensive than not. And so their habits in this space is really changing. So students having to work part-time jobs to cover costs, and that's really squeezing their time in terms of having to study, but also having to work as well to cover just the cost of living, because the maintenance loan just doesn't do that. And this report highlights that. We've also seen over 3/4 report to be socialising less, and the impact that that has on their mental health and on their community within the university as well. So looking at all of this together is that students can't support the local community as they have been doing in the past with helping with food banks, because now we've got 1 in 10 students actually accessing those food banks themselves, as recorded by NUS as well. So it's a really, really stark statistic to add a bit of realism to this data that, yes, the maintenance loan isn't enough, but what that looks like on the ground is really, really impacting how students actually live their day-to-day life, not just that they're working, but also what they're passionate about, how they live their lives, what they're engaging in extracurricularly, whether they're, as Professor Harrington said, engaging with extracurricular activity. At Bangor, we're incredibly lucky to be able to provide free sports club societies and volunteering for our students. But the ability of us to offer that provision is really, really needs to be protected. But at the same time, those costs are going up for us as a students' union as well. So that's something that we've really got to be aware of and how we manage that over the next couple of years. So some of the projects we've been working on as a students' union, to add a bit of Bangor context to this, we identified that rent takes out the biggest chunk of the budget, again reflected by this report. So as with Greenwich, we've frozen halls costs across the university and also provided budget halls accommodation for students at a wider availability, which has been really, really highly uptaken and actually fills up a lot quicker than some of the high quality accommodation elsewhere across the university. So it really shows that students are at the moment price sensitive rather than quality sensitive as well. We've also worked with the university on covering food costs, looking at groceries as the second biggest expenditure, looking at providing £2 hot lunches for students daily, and offering food vouchers as well for students that can't cover costs outside of that. So all of these are things that we're working with the university on, but within the Students' Union, we've had to create a fancy dress box and an interview clothing box for students to come in and borrow those sorts of clothes to be able to participate in interviews and participate in socials around the university as well, preventing cost barriers to participating in these. We also give out free toiletries and reusable period products to ensure that students that have cost barriers, it's not preventing students' personal hygiene needs. One activity that brings it all together in terms of trying to promote the interests of students and trying to cut the costs of promoting these interests is Clothes Swap and Repair Cafe. So that's linking together sustainability and the cost of living, where students can swap clothes and repair bikes, clothing and electronics that the local community support them with, but also students are upskilling each other and themselves to be able to repair these items and help their community themselves. But both this promotes sustainability and covers costs and prevents students from buying new and helps each other. This was begun as an SU initiative, but is now wholly organised by students who are absolutely fantastic, learning the skills they need to propagate this and essentially do this when they think is best for students. So I'll stop talking now as well, but some of these initiatives don't cost anything. It's about the skills we're giving to students and about the habits that students have being fundamentally changed by the costs that they're facing. So it's very, very real for us, and we see this on a daily basis. And it's not just about covering cost of food and rent, even though that is extremely important. It's about fundamentally changing the entire student experience as well. So this report is incredibly important and well welcomed from us too.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nyah. I think you put your finger on it there, didn't you? That the country's getting richer, but somehow the student experience seems to be getting poorer in many respects. So maybe I could ask all the panelists, all the people who've spoken, to put their cameras on, and we're going to go to the questions. We've got about 20 minutes for questions. We've got a hard cut-off at 10 o'clock. I'm going to take groups of questions so that we do more than one group and get through as many questions as possible. And I'm going to go first to Mike Larkin. And Mike, I'm just going to turn your microphone on and hopefully we can hear you now.
Hi.
Hi, good morning.
Great. I was busily looking at the report there and you took me by surprise. I noticed in the report that you mentioned estranged students, and I'm particularly concerned about this because Standalone, as the charity that's helped estranged students, has just stepped away, and there's an attempt to keep it going. But the more I looked into it, students who don't have support from their families, either partial or total, they really have difficulty sometimes proving that they're estranged, even though they can self-declare on the UCAS form. So I wondered if you found any evidence that these students were particularly getting into sticky problems because they literally have no family to back them up. In my
Great.
personal view, I found when I was a student in the 70s, my family didn't back me, and it was very difficult, and I had no other support. And I've come across many students since who have found themselves in that position. I hope you found something on that.
Okay, thank you. Mike will remember that question, panelists. There's the next question. I'm going to do them in the order they've been upvoted, is from an anonymous attendee. So I'm going to read it out. It says, great research, thank you, and a really important contribution to the cost of living debate. To be provocative, I was interested in the breakdown of weekly expenditure. Some of the figures do appear to stretch the concept of minimum level of funding needed. If we extrapolate to a year, the research is saying students need to spend a minimum of £520 a year on taxis, for instance. I fear that such assertions fail the Daily Mail test. To what extent have some of these figures been challenged or mediated by the team, please? So there's a question. And now I'm going to go to Jonathan Neves, who's head of surveys at Advance HE. Jonathan, I'm just going to turn your microphone on.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Nick. Just a quick question that particularly related to Josh's slides, but other colleagues may have a view. And I couldn't see all the data on the slides, but Josh in particular mentioned the number of hours worked by students, and I just wondered if there'd been a comparison to what we do know in terms of wider studies, not least the student academic experience survey that I work on with yourself, Josh, and Nick, about the average hours in previous years that students already work. So are students already working those number of hours, or are they working more than those hours at the moment? And so I was just particularly interested in that data, and obviously we're keen to look at what 2024 brings in those hours worked as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm going to take one more question before I go back to the panel, and then I'll ask for crisp answers so we can do another round. And the next question is going to be from Johnny Rich. Johnny, your microphone's now on.
Hi, thanks very much, and brilliant research, and deeply depressing, but very valuable indeed. I wanted to ask about if we could persuade those in power to raise student maintenance support to the levels discussed, what additional measures would be needed to ensure that this doesn't immediately get channeled into the pockets of landlords raising rents because they just feel that students can now afford more? That's not only a concern for the students who would then be in no better position, but also it would have a big impact on local communities beyond the universities in inflation in the rental market.
Great, thanks, Johnny. I'm going to ask for crisp answers because there's lots of questions flooding in now. So should we go to Katherine first? Particularly, Katherine, can you do this Daily Mail £520 on taxis question?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think, as Josh alluded to, we did have some really detailed discussions about some of these issues. I think the taxi issue in particular was around participation, being able to go out every so often. So, you know, if they went out once a week, you might be coming back late. So things here included about safety, coming back late at night for safety reasons. In actual fact, some people said, well, actually, that's not enough. £10 a week is not enough. You know, £10, it costs more than that to get a taxi from the outskirts of the city where the student area housing that they were living in to the centre. They sort of compromised that, so you could share. The other thing, it's not just going out. We talked about, people were talking about working. So this isn't just about their social lives. Actually, in the reality, students are working. So if they're working late, it's about getting back from work as well. So I think it's sort of bringing that into it as well. And yeah, so I can understand how someone might put that together and think, oh, that's quite a lot. But when you think what's behind it, and there are other areas where they were really quite contained. So for example, as I said earlier, that the sort of study costs, they had a lot of discussion and actually agreed you didn't really need books. You could get those by being passed on or by or online. So there was a very, very minimal budget in there for things like that. A mobile phone, it's not an Apple or an iPhone, it's a very basic level phone. So and with a 5 GB of data. So there are areas where it might be far below what someone in that situation might actually be expecting to have. So I think that.
Thank you, Katherine. Brilliant. Thank you. Can I look to Jane? Jane, have you got anything to add on, particularly on this is strange students point? What does Greenwich do about is strange students?
Yeah, I mean, strange students are really challenging because sometimes you don't know they're estranged till they've arrived, and that can be part of the problem. But obviously, what we do is we offer our accommodation throughout the whole year for those students, so they don't actually have to leave. Because of course, for many of those students, when they're in halls, that is their home. There is literally nowhere else for them to go. So we've been quite careful about doing that. We prioritise giving them jobs. And we do have for some students a further package of support, and we also have a dedicated, if you like, support worker that supports them. So there are things you can do, but I think for me the challenge often is knowing actually who those students are when they arrive initially, because the more you know, the more you can do and put in place. Can I, Nick, if it's okay with you, could I just very quickly go to that question that was asked about, does it pass the Daily Mail test?
Yeah.
Because I do think, for me, that was the one issue I would have with the report is, does it do that? And if you want to actually go to government and make requests, you've got to, I think, be very clear on that. I absolutely hear what Katherine's saying, but I think for me, that is the element where I do think some of those, it's acceptable for students to have to work to actually pay for some of those elements. And I do think we need to be quite clear about that, because I don't think we can expect this to be provided in its entirety by government. So, for me, actually working no more than 10 or 12 hours actually I don't believe there's plenty of studies to show that doesn't affect actual outcomes for students. It's once they get beyond about, I think from my memory, and I might be wrong on this, I think it's once they get beyond about 15 hours that it does. So, right. So I think it is worth just thinking about actually how that might be packaged up to governments, to future governments, to actually present that, because I think that would help.
Thank you, Jane. Let's go to Josh then, who may have views on that, but keep it crisp, Josh, but also the question about Jonathan Neaves's question about part-time work. Yeah,
thank you. I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's important to stress that this is not this is not survival. This is having a broader university experience, and we've not stepped in and said, well, actually that's too much on taxis, or why should students get a TV? This is things that students have told us that are important to them, and we've reproduced that loyally in the report based on a mediated consensus in the focus groups which Katherine and Matt led. So it very much is drawn from students, and there are some things there that are surprising, but I think that's why the research is so valuable, is because it gets us in touch. Now, then an important point you raised is that, is it fair for government to cover all of these costs? There are some things that certainly do go beyond survival and social activities and various other things like that. And we're very clear in the report that we're not expecting government to cover the whole thing. It would be a significant increase in maintenance support. And while we do think that maintenance support should be increased, the level that would be required here is probably too high. So we do think it's reasonable for students to do some part-time work. And on that question, and Jonathan Neaves, I think you know the answer to this, but the majority of students now who do work is 55% who do part-time work during term time, and of those who work, they work an average of about 14 hours. And it is based on previous research by HEPI and by others. It's about 14 to 17 hours. Once you exceed that per week, it does start to affect your academic performance. But it's academic performance, and it will be a much earlier point than that. We know that students, the first thing when they're time poor or they have limited money, that the first thing that goes is social activities and extracurricular activities. And so even working only 5 or 10 hours a week, they will have to cut something else back. And many universities say 15 hours is the strict limit. So a few things to balance there.
I'm going to pause you there because I want to get through all the questions if we can. Nyah, very quickly, Johnny Rich's question, will any extra support just be swallowed up in rent? Is that something that worries you?
It is something that worries me at the minute, in that the extra support that's given, the rent around student accommodation areas skyrockets. It's captive audience essentially, because in Bangor the rents are a lot higher than the surrounding areas, especially that students are living in HMOs. So previously there's been work looked into rent caps, but the risk of that being that people put up rents before the rent cap comes into effect, and that negatively affecting students for years to come as well. So there's a very significant risk that that does go straight into rents. But it's also needed in that rents are going to increase anyway with the cost of living and with inflation. And so if no increase is made, students are going to absorb that extra cost anyway. So there is a risk here, but it's who is absorbing that cost, because at the minute it's students that are absorbing that cost. And going back to Jonathan's question about how students work and part-time jobs and how that affects students, where you live in that and what type of student you are really affects on whether you have the ability to work. For example, in places like Bangor, which is quite rural, there aren't many jobs around the place, so you've got to then travel out to jobs, and they're also quite often Welsh language essential, so people coming in from England won't be able to access those jobs. So it's about where you are, but also whether you've got the ability to work. If you've got a disability, you can't. So taking that into consideration, the location of the university and the situation of any given student.
Thank you, Nyah. Right, I'm going to go, we've got 12 open questions and about 9 minutes to get through them. So we're going to go very quickly. Martin Lowe's got a question also about working. Martin, your microphone's on.
No, thank you. And yeah, just echoing everybody else's thoughts, this is a brilliant piece of work that moves the discussion forward in terms of maintenance needs. As Josh may be aware, we're doing a lot of work around student working lives, around part-time work, and a lot of the question has been answered already. But really, my question is around what does the sector need to do? What does the universities need to do? And this more a growing acknowledgement that part-time work is a necessity now. It's not a kind of it's not a choice on students' behalf. And what do we need to do more of in terms of centralized timetabling, better supporting for those students in terms of work rights, flexible assessments, that side of things. But as I say, brilliant report, and it will help our research moving forward as well.
Thank you, Martin. Where are you from? You keep saying we. What organisation are you talking on behalf of?
I apologise. It's University of Central Lancashire.
Great, UCLan. Great. Thanks very much. There's an anonymous question asking, does the research look at students in non-traditional delivery models? Very clear in the report that we are looking at second and third year students living in off-street housing. So they're living in your typical shared student house. They're undergraduates, the second or third years. Other students are not covered. The numbers may be the same, they may be different. We'd love to do more research on that if you'd like to fund us to do it. Let's go to Mike Ratcliffe. Mike, I'm just about to turn your microphone on if I can. For some reason, I can't turn Mike's microphone on, so I'll read it out. It will be important to add the additional dimension of students who are not living away from home. Government looks at maintenance. They may need to question the London, not London split, and the living a home, not living a home split, because you get currently, of course, different levels of maintenance for those things. Then there's another anonymous question. It's important to note the funding from the Student Loans Company does not acknowledge the funding gap for students who are care experienced, both meeting and not meeting the legal definition, and those who are estranged. We've had that question as well already, and those who are over 25 who do not have family support. Further, many areas do not have flexible jobs available to students, as the non-student population are in the jobs. Right. So some points there I'm going to ask people to go to. And then Martin Blakey. Sorry, again, something seems to have gone wrong with the text, so I can't turn your microphone on. So I'm going to ask Martin's question. Martin is an expert on student accommodation. Martin's question is, with the percentage of MIS covered by existing maintenance support, excluding London, ranging from 44% to 65%, is there any evidence on whether these existing variations are reflected in different attrition rates or on academic achievement, so on dropout rates and academic achievement? Can I have one more go at turning someone's microphone on? Claire Callender. Claire, it's letting me turn your microphone on, so over to you.
Hi. This is absolutely a great report, and I'm delighted to see it because the findings are so very, very important, in particular highlighting the shortfall in student funding to cover the rising costs of learning. So my question is, how do we encourage government to change policy to address the issues highlighted, given the squeeze on public expenditure? Because we can see that from Jane that institutions don't have the funds to meet that gap. The work being done at Bangor is fabulous, but I don't know whether it can be reproduced at other universities. So a certain amount of this has to come from directly from government. What do we do to convince them, given efforts so far and existing research using classic, uncontroversial, in inverted commas, modes of looking at expenditure and income have failed to budge the government?
Thank you, Claire. I'm going to have to go back to the panelists now because we've only got 3 minutes. There are some other very interesting questions there, including one asking whether students had views on parental contributions. So I am going to turn back to our panelists. You've only got a minute each. Pick and choose what you want to respond to, and this is your only chance to speak before the end of the webinar finishes. So there's a challenge. I'm going to go reverse order. Nyah.
So responding to whether students have a impact on or thoughts on parental contributions, this is up to the parents of the students as well as the students themselves. We've mentioned in the past webinar that the parents' contribution really is affected by the parents' situation themselves. This grant allocation or loan allocation isn't based off of whether parents have multiple children to support, whether it's based off of whether they've got parents themselves they need to support and what the family situation is for them. Also, estranged students, as mentioned earlier, find it really challenging to prove that in some cases. And so this is a really big challenge for students. And we've seen only 50% get the support they need, but over 50% having to pay those extra costs themselves due to the expectation that that loan has a shortfall. So I'll leave it there in terms of answering that question, and I hope that helps.
Thank you, Nyah. I found a question in the House of Commons from 1969 yesterday where an MP said, should it be a legal requirement on parents to pay what they're expected to pay as the parental contribution, which is an interesting but controversial idea. Let's go to Jane.
Okay, I'll be very quick for you, Nick. I'll just address the question about how do we convince government, and I think what I would say is I think certainly the shadow government ministers, I think, do get this argument, and I think this report gives them evidence that they haven't had before. So I think it's really helpful. I think one way that we can convince all governments or whoever it is next is to actually be very clear on who we would expect to be responsible for which parts of an MIS. And as Josh quite rightly says, it wouldn't entirely be government. And I think that's an important point to make, because I think it will land much better with that.
Great. And I don't think I'm breaking any confidence in saying we have already been into both the Department for Education and leading Labour figures to talk to them about this research. Obviously, it's up to them whether they implement policy recommendations on the back of it or not. Josh.
Yes, I'll pick up on the issue about should the maintenance support system be more broken down further? So, for example, should we have more maintenance support for very expensive cities or not, beyond the just London, not London divide? I think there would be some support for this, but I think two important risks with an approach like that is the first is you risk fueling rents in these cities, as we spoke about a moment ago, is that if you provide more money for expensive cities, that may well just be taken by by landlords, that wouldn't actually solve the issue. So there's a concern there. And I also think simplicity of any system is absolutely vital. The current system is very complicated. And many people, for example, say they're surprised by how little they get when they finally get their maintenance support through. Having lots of different variables saying maybe you get this, maybe you get this in these circumstances, might get some students more money, but they would potentially make the system significantly more complex. And I'm not sure that's better. There's other things I could say, but I'll pass to Katherine.
Thank you. And I'm sure all our panelists are happy to continue this conversation by email, and we will circulate people's slides after the event as well. Final word to you, Katherine.
Thank you. I think I just want to say that I think we very much recognise it's the starting point. And with our main MIS, we also have done additional work on different household types where needs vary. And I think that's very much needs to be recognised, that from the conversations that have been in the chat and raised by the other speakers about students in different situations.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry to call it to a halt in a way, because I think we could have gone on talking for a lot longer, but we'd like to continue this conversation on our website, through our blog, through further events. We've got an event, for example, coming up later in the month on non-continuation rates, which came up. We've got another event coming up on the Australian Accord process, which is a nice segue into reminding people that we simply could not have done this work without the support that we've got from our sponsors, TechnologyOne, and we're very, very grateful for that and for co-hosting this event this morning with them, and in particular to colleagues there, Leo, Michael, Georgia, Peter and the rest. And then I'd like to thank Loughborough, Katherine and Matt Padley for doing the hard work here, Josh and my other colleague Lucy for overseeing it from HEPI's perspective and liaising between the various partners. Jane, to you for what I know is a very busy period in universities at the moment, for telling us your views from Greenwich's perspective, and Nyah, from your perspective as an experienced student union president, and good luck with the job hunting. I know this point in the student union president's career, it's always an interesting moment to see what you go on to do. So thank you everyone for listening. We've recorded it. We'll make the recording available. The report's on our website. And I hope, as all our panelists have said, this conversation will continue, because it is unbelievably important. Thank you very much.